Every decade produces a handful of massive names that get remembered forever, and a much longer list of genuinely great bands that quietly slip through the cracks of history. The 1970s had more of those than almost any other era. Groups that filled arenas or dominated FM radio for a stretch, and then simply faded from the conversation. So today, we're counting down 12 forgotten bands from 1970s that still hold up in 2026. Number 12. Golden Earring. Golden Earring had already been together for over a decade by the time most American listeners ever heard of them, forming in the Netherlands back in 1961 and steadily building a following across Europe long before they made any real impact overseas. That changed in 1973 with Radar Love, a driving, hypnotic rock track that became an international hit and remains a staple of classic rock radio to this day. The band kept working steadily through the rest of the decade and beyond, releasing well-regarded albums that never quite matched that single's reach in the US, even as they stayed enormously popular back home in the Netherlands for decades afterward. Golden Earring's mix of hard rock muscle and melodic songwriting holds up remarkably well today. And Radar Love, in particular, still sounds every bit as urgent now as it did the year it was released, even if the band's name itself rarely gets mentioned outside of that one song. The band's lineup, anchored for decades by guitarist George Kooijmans and singer Barry Hay, gave them a stability that few of their peers ever managed, allowing them to keep refining their sound across dozens of albums long after most 70s bands had either broken up or faded into nostalgia acts. Back home, Golden Earring's concerts remained a genuine cultural institution well into the 21st century, a level of ongoing relevance that stands in sharp contrast to how little recognition the band ever received internationally beyond their handful of crossover hits. Number 11. Stars. Stars formed in New York in 1976, built around a glam-influenced hard rock sound that leaned into big hooks and an even bigger visual presentation, complete with elaborate stage outfits that fit right in with the mid-70s arena rock scene. Their song Cherry Baby, from their self-titled debut album, got solid radio play and helped the band build a loyal following, though wider mainstream recognition never quite followed. Stars released a handful of albums before disbanding in 1980, and while their commercial run was brief, their influence turned out to be longer-lasting than their chart performance suggested, with several bands that broke through in the glam metal scene of the following decade, citing them as a direct inspiration. Listening back now, Stars sounds like a clear bridge between 70s arena rock and the more polished, hook-driven hard rock that would dominate radio a few years later, which makes their relative obscurity today feel more like bad timing than any lack of quality. Guitarist Richie Rano and the rest of the band had come out of an earlier project called Fallen Angels, and they carried that same attention to tight songwriting and stage spectacle straight into Stars, recording with producer Jack Douglas, who was already well known for his work with major rock acts of the period. The band's catalog has quietly found new appreciation among collectors and classic rock enthusiasts in recent years, even though mainstream radio still rarely gives them the airplay their material would easily support. Number 10. Sparks. Sparks, led by brothers Ron and Russell Mael, had already been recording for a few years under different names, before relocating temporarily to England, where their 1974 album Kimono My House and its single This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us turned them into genuine stars across the UK and much of Europe. American audiences, by contrast, were slower to embrace the band's theatrical style and Ron Mael's deliberately unsettling stage persona. And despite years of consistently inventive work throughout the rest of the decade, Sparks never became a true household name in their own country. The band kept working steadily through the following decades regardless, quietly building one of the more unusual and durable catalogs in pop music history. Renewed attention arrived decades later through a documentary and film work that introduced their story to audiences who had never encountered them the first time around. But for most of the years in between, Sparks remained one of the most talented, least recognized bands to come out of the entire decade. Ron Mael's songwriting during this period was known for its sharp, often absurdist wit, paired with Russell's soaring vocal delivery, a combination that made the band nearly impossible to categorize alongside anything else on the radio at the time. Even follow-up albums like Propaganda, released later in 1974, continued building on that same inventive formula, earning strong reviews across Europe while barely registering with American audiences, who simply didn't have a comparable reference point for what the band was doing. Number 9. Badfinger. Badfinger had one of the most promising starts imaginable, signed directly to the Beatles' own Apple Records label, with Paul McCartney writing their first hit, Come and Get It, in 1969, and George Harrison producing their 1971 single Day After Day. Songs like No Matter What and Baby Blue gave the band a genuine run of hits in the early part of the decade, built on the kind of melodic, guitar-driven songwriting that closely echoed their famous label mates. Behind the scenes, though, the band became entangled in serious financial mismanagement involving their business manager, leaving members without access to money they'd legitimately earned even as their records continued selling. The strain of those disputes weighed heavily on the band for years, and songwriter Pete Ham died in 1975 amid the mounting financial pressure, with bandmate Tom Evans passing years later under similarly difficult circumstances. Badfinger's music itself has aged beautifully, and Baby Blue found an unexpected resurgence decades later after being featured prominently at the close of the television series Breaking Bad, reminding an entirely new audience just how strong their songwriting had always been. The band's original lineup, rounded out by Joey Molland and Mike Gibbons, had genuine chemistry as musicians, even as the business side of their career fell apart around them. And their 4 core studio albums together are still regarded by many critics as some of the most underrated guitar pop of the entire decade. It remains one of the more heartbreaking stories in rock history, precisely because the music itself gave no indication of the turmoil surrounding the band, standing instead as some of the warmest, most melodically confident songwriting to come out of the early 70s. Number 8. Ambrosia.
You're the biggest part of me.
Ambrosia formed in Los Angeles in 1970, starting out with genuinely ambitious, progressive-leaning arrangements before gradually shifting toward the smoother, more melodic sound that would define their biggest hits later in the decade. Holding On to Yesterday, released in 1975, became their breakout single, and showcased the band's knack for combining intricate musicianship with genuinely catchy songwriting, a combination that carried through into later songs like How Much I Feel a few years afterward. Despite consistently strong musicianship and a run of well-received albums, Ambrosia never quite achieved the household name status of other soft rock acts working the same lane during the same stretch of years. The band's sound has aged unusually well, largely because their arrangements were built on real musical complexity rather than simple radio-friendly formulas, giving the songs more to notice on repeated listens than most of what surrounded them on the charts at the time. For a band that came so close to major stardom, Ambrosia remains surprisingly absent from most conversations about the decade's best pop rock songwriting. Several of the group's members had backgrounds rooted in classical and jazz training, which shows up clearly in the unusual chord voicings and shifting arrangements running underneath even their most radio-friendly material. The band earned multiple Grammy nominations across the decade and worked with respected producers who helped shape their evolving sound. Yet despite that critical recognition, Ambrosia has rarely received the same lasting acknowledgement given to other soft rock acts of the period, whose commercial success, while comparable, wasn't always matched by the same level of musical ambition. Number 7. Stealers Wheel. Stealers Wheel formed in Scotland in 1972 around songwriters Gerry Rafferty and Joe Egan, and their very first single, Stuck in the Middle with You, became an immediate hit that year, climbing into the top 10 on both sides of the Atlantic. The band struggled to build on that early success, amid lineup changes and legal disputes with their management. And by the middle of the decade, Rafferty had already left to pursue a solo career that would eventually produce Baker Street, one of the biggest hits of the following era. Stealers Wheel effectively disbanded not long after, leaving behind a small but genuinely strong catalog that rarely gets mentioned outside of that one signature single. That song itself found a strange second life nearly 2 decades later after being featured prominently in Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, introducing an entirely new generation to a band most of them had never previously heard of. The rest of their catalog, largely overlooked even by that resurgence, holds up as sharp, well-crafted folk rock songwriting from 2 genuinely talented writers. Rafferty and Egan had actually first played together years earlier in a different Scottish group before forming Stealers Wheel, and their songwriting partnership carried a clear knack for blending wry, observational lyrics with melodies catchy enough to disguise how sharp the writing underneath them really was. Legal wrangling over their contract kept the band from releasing new music for long stretches, even as their popularity was still building. A frustrating pattern that ultimately did as much to end the group as any creative differences between its members.
Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. Yes,
Number 6. Nazareth.
love her.
Nazareth formed in Scotland in 1968 and spent the first several years of their career building a reputation as a hard-touring, no-frills rock band before finally breaking through commercially in the mid-1970s. Their 1975 album, Hair of the Dog, gave them a genuine rock radio staple with its title track, but it was their cover of Love Hurts, originally written by Boudleaux Bryant and previously recorded by the Everly Brothers. That turned into their biggest hit, climbing into the American top 10 the following year. The band kept a devoted international following for years afterward, touring steadily and remaining especially popular in parts of Europe, even as mainstream attention in the United States gradually cooled. What stands out listening to Nazareth today is the sheer range within their catalog, moving comfortably between the raw, riff-driven energy of their harder material and the genuine vulnerability of a ballad like Love Hurts, a combination that many harder rock bands of the era never quite managed to pull off convincingly. Producer Roger Glover, best known as the bassist of Deep Purple, worked closely with the band during this stretch and helped sharpen the sound that carried them through their most successful run of albums. Nazareth continued recording and touring for decades afterward, with singer Dan McCafferty's distinctive rasp remaining the band's defining feature well into later lineups, a level of longevity that few of their contemporaries from the same Scottish rock scene ever came close to matching.
Love her.
Number 5. Klaatu.
California's on my mind.
Klaatu formed in Toronto and released their debut album in 1976 without including any photos, names, or biographical information about the band members, a decision that turned out to have unexpected consequences. Listeners and critics began speculating that the anonymous band might secretly be a reunited Beatles recording under a different name, a rumor that spread quickly through American radio and press coverage and briefly sent sales of their single calling occupants of interplanetary craft climbing. Once the true members, John Woloschuk, Dee Long, and Terry Draper, were eventually identified, the novelty of the mystery faded fast, and so did much of the band's commercial momentum along with it. Klaatu continued making music through several more albums before disbanding in the early 1980s, leaving behind a catalog that, once separated from the Beatles rumor that briefly defined them, reveals genuinely inventive, melodic pop songwriting in its own right. It's a rare case of a band's biggest moment of fame having almost nothing to do with the actual music they were making. What often gets lost in the story is how genuinely well-crafted the songwriting behind that mystery actually was, drawing on the same lush harmonies and ambitious studio production that defined a lot of the era's most polished pop, without ever leaning on the Beatles comparison as anything more than an accident of timing and anonymity. The band members later admitted they hadn't anticipated the rumor at all when they chose to keep their identities out of the album's packaging. And by the time later releases confirmed who they actually were, much of the curiosity that had briefly carried them onto the charts had already moved on to other things. Number 4. Gentle Giant. Gentle Giant formed in England in 1970 and quickly built a reputation for some of the most technically demanding, densely arranged progressive rock of the entire decade, built around multi-instrumentalist band members who regularly swapped between guitars, keyboards, woodwinds, and strings within a single song. Albums like Octopus, released in 1972, and Free Hand from 1975, earned deep respect from musicians and dedicated prog fans without ever translating into the kind of mainstream chart success enjoyed by some of their more accessible peers. The band's willingness to fold classical composition techniques and unconventional time signatures into rock music made them a genuinely difficult act to categorize, which likely limited their commercial reach even as it built their reputation among serious listeners. Gentle Giant disbanded in 1980 after a full decade of consistently ambitious work, and while they never enjoyed anything close to arena-filling fame, musicians across several genres have continued citing their arrangements as a benchmark for how complex rock music could get, without losing its sense of melody entirely. The band, led by the three Shulman brothers alongside a rotating cast of equally skilled multi-instrumentalists, deliberately set out with a stated goal of pushing rock music toward the kind of structural complexity more commonly associated with classical composition, an approach they stuck with even as it limited their commercial prospects. Their live shows became legendary among fans for the sheer logistics involved, with band members regularly swapping instruments mid-song in ways that were nearly impossible to replicate without the kind of rehearsal discipline few rock bands of the period were willing to commit to. Number 3. Head East. Head East came out of Illinois in the early 1970s, building a following through relentless regional touring before their 1975 album Flat as a Pancake gave them a genuine hit with Never Been Any Reason. The song became a staple of album-oriented FM radio and helped the record go platinum, but the band never managed to turn that momentum into the kind of sustained national profile that so many of their peers achieved. Head East kept releasing music and touring for years afterward, remaining especially popular in the Midwest, even as their national visibility faded. Part of what makes the band worth revisiting now is just how tightly constructed their best material is, with layered keyboards and guitar work that holds its own against far more famous album rock acts from the same period. For listeners who grew up catching them on the radio between bigger names, rediscovering Head East today tends to feel less like nostalgia and more like finally giving a genuinely strong band its due. Interestingly, Flat as a Pancake originally sold well enough on the strength of independent regional distribution alone that a major label picked it up for wider release only after the fact, an unusual path for an album to take at the time, and a sign of just how strong the band's grassroots following already was before the industry caught on. Head East continued to tour for decades afterward with various lineup changes, and original members have periodically continued performing under the band's name well into recent years, keeping the group's live legacy alive long after their commercial radio presence faded. Number 2. Pavlov's Dog. Pavlov's Dog came together in St. Louis in the early 1970s, built around a progressive rock sound and the extraordinarily distinctive high-pitched voice of frontman David Surkamp, a vocal style that made the band instantly recognizable the moment a song started. Their debut album, Pampered Menial, released in 1975, drew serious critical attention and built real anticipation for a breakthrough that never quite materialized on the same scale as their more commercially successful prog-adjacent peers. Legal disputes with their label disrupted the band during a crucial early stretch, slowing momentum right as they seemed poised to break through nationally. Pavlov's Dog kept working in various forms for years afterward, and Surkamp continued performing and recording well into later decades. But the band never fully escaped the shadow of what might have been if that early momentum hadn't been interrupted. Revisiting their catalog now, the ambition and unusual vocal texture still stand out as something genuinely different from most of what else was on the radio at the time. The band's sound drew comparisons to progressive acts like Yes and King Crimson for its layered arrangements, while Surkamp's voice, often likened to a far more delicate counterpart to Rush's Geddy Lee, gave the group an identity nothing else on the airwaves quite matched. Their follow-up album, At the Sound of the Bell, released in 1976, continued in that same ambitious direction. And although commercial breakthrough never arrived, the band has maintained a small but devoted following of listeners who consider their early records among the more underrated progressive rock releases of the entire decade. Number 1. Big Star. Big Star formed in Memphis in 1971 around Alex Chilton, who'd already had chart success years earlier as the teenage lead singer of the Box Tops, and Chris Bell, whose songwriting partnership with Chilton produced some of the most melodically sharp guitar pop of the decade. Their debut album, Number 1 Record, released in 1972, and its follow-up, Radio City, in 1974, were met with strong reviews, but virtually no commercial success. Hampered by distribution problems that kept the records out of stores even as critics praised them. The band effectively dissolved after recording a third, darker album that wasn't released until years later. And Big Star never came close to achieving the mainstream recognition their songwriting clearly deserved during their active years together. Their influence turned out to be enormous anyway, quietly shaping an entire generation of alternative and power pop musicians who discovered the records years after the fact and pointed directly to Big Star as a foundational influence. Decades later, one of their songs even became widely known as the opening theme for a popular television show, introducing millions of viewers to a band most of them had genuinely never heard of before. Chris Bell left the group not long after their debut, struggling with the frustration of the album's commercial failure despite its glowing reviews, and Chilton carried the band forward through its remaining records with a rotating cast of collaborators. The unfinished, darker tone of their third album has since become almost as celebrated among devoted fans as the two records that preceded it, seen by many as a raw, unfiltered document of a band that never got the commercial validation its songwriting so clearly deserved during the years it was actually being made. That wraps up our countdown of forgotten bands from the 1970s, whose music has aged far better than their name recognition ever did. Some of these groups came agonizingly close to lasting stardom before circumstances outside their control got in the way, while others were simply too far ahead of what radio and audiences were ready for at the time. Every one of them left behind a catalog worth returning to, the kind of songwriting that still holds up on its own merits decades later. Whether or not most listeners today could put a name to the band behind it, if any of these brought back a memory, let us know in the comments which one you remember hearing first. And if you enjoyed this trip through some of the decade's most underrated music, give the video a like and subscribe for more nostalgic countdowns like this one.